on time, but we'll start today's session. All right. So, our first keynote, which I'm very excited to announce this morning, is Ruha Benjamin. So the first thing that I wanted to say when I saw Ruha was joining us at the Indaba was just how badass her profile picture is. But obviously, in addition to this very awesome profile picture, she has an illustrious career to back this up. So she is an associate professor at the African American Studies at Princeton University, where she studies the social dimensions of science, technology, and medicine. She's also the founder of the Just Data Lab and the author of 2 books, People Science and Race After Technology. And Ruha's personal story is that she has arrived here via a winding road, passing through Los Angeles, South Carolina, the South Pacific, and Swaziland. And this winding road has gone on to influence her writings and teachings about the relationships between knowledge and power, race and citizenship, and health and justice. So we'll be hearing a little bit more about this in her keynote talk. So please join me in welcoming Ruha.
Awesome, thank you. Great. You can take this. Oh, you can take that. Good morning. How many of you have gotten at least 6 hours of sleep? Someone said, what sleep? All right, so I'm going on fumes on 4 hours. So what I'm going to ask for you is to give me all your energy, okay? You can grunt, you can move your head, you can stomp, but just talk back to me as we go on this morning. So the title of my keynote is Beyond Buzzwords: Innovation, Inequity, and Imagination in the 21st Century. And before we jump into this, and the theme of today is going deeper, I would just want to ask us to acknowledge that in addition to all the stuff that's going on in our head, we live inside of bodies. And so our bodies need to get a little bit of movement this morning. If you can stand up, stretch, turn, give your neighbor a shoulder rub if you want. All right, wake up, wake up. Come closer if you want, if you're in the back, so you can see the slides. All right, let's get started. How many of you recognize who this is? Yep, who is it? Lieutenant Uhura! All right, and so, you know what? I just want to thank the Indaba organizers. Their vision about how we're going to captain this ship that we're in. It's more than just taking the seat of power, right? Lieutenant moving into the captain's role. Africa taking its place in AI, but it's actually questioning the direction that we're moving in, so that you don't just inherit the power of old, but you think about what new direction do we want to move this field in, not necessarily emulating the way things have always been done. So part of what we're doing today and over the course of the week is to animate our imagination about this future that we're co-creating. So it's more than a set of technical exercises. It's a social experiment. It's a social imaginary that we're cultivating together. So to begin, I have a pop quiz for you. You're going to turn to your neighbor and you're going to do 2 things. You're going to try to guess who said this, and no Googling. Do not put it in. When I do this with students, the first thing they do is go to their phones. And I'm like, that's not what you do in the quiz. So I want you to try to guess who said this. We have guided missiles and misguided men. And then after you try to guess who said that, I want you just to share something personal with your neighbor. Share with them something that brings you joy, something that makes you happy. And don't say Indaba, okay? That's the wrong answer. We already know that, okay? So something else outside of work, outside of school, that brings you joy. And you have like 30 seconds, so go. All right, let's come back together. Any guesses? Who? Shakespeare, Yoda. Who? JFK. Getting closer. Warm. Huh? Who? Who? Ronald Reagan. Oh no. MLK, and the winner goes to MLK. All right. You'll get some sort of prize. We'll figure it out. Okay. All right. And then happy places. Any unusual happy places out there that you shared or that your neighbor shared? What? Say it again. Oh, stadium. Okay, yeah. Oh, okay. One more. Say it again. Oh, the desert. Namibia desert? Yeah, wow. Wow, okay. So I want us to invoke our happy place. One, just to acknowledge that, you know, we have lives outside of work that also we have to tap into. Someone asked earlier about, you know, how to get through a PhD. Part of how you get through a PhD is to deliberately, actively fuel yourself with things that make you happy and joyful. Otherwise, you burn out, right? And so let's make sure we keep one eye on the stuff that also, in addition to work, fuels us. But also, the reason why I want us to start with our happy place is to acknowledge that for the next 40 minutes or so, this room is not going to be your happy place. By that I mean the stuff that we're going to get into, going deeper, is going to be uncomfortable to really acknowledge and think about, all right? So can you guys be with me on that? Are we going to embrace that? Okay, so when I say something or share something that's going to be a bit difficult, I just want you to just realize that you have your happy place, but this is not it, okay? I just want us to start there. And one of my favorite writers put it like this, someone who just passed away, Toni Morrison. Our future is ripe, outrageously rich in its possibilities. Yet unleashing the glory of that future will require difficult labor. And some may be so frightened of its birth, they will refuse to abandon their nostalgia for the womb. It's another way of thinking about how we recreate this feeling of the womb through comfort zones, who our friends are, where our neighborhoods are. And even when we think about disciplinary wombs, we get comfortable within certain kinds of disciplinary ways of thinking and knowing. And in many ways, what I would like to do this morning is to stretch you out of your womb, all right? It's gonna feel like contractions, all right? When the baby's being born, it thinks it's dying, all right? That's why it comes out hollering and screaming, right? But in fact, it's growing into a much bigger reality that it can't even imagine. And so as I start to get on your nerves and say things that trouble you, just experience it like a contraction. It's just pushing you to think beyond your disciplinary training, to incorporate other layers of the phenomenon that we're talking about as AI, all right? So the question is, what is deep about deep learning, right? Is it only mathematically deep, computationally deep? Or do we also want to add different layers to this depth? Do we want to wrestle with the social and historical depths of data? Even further, do we want to go deep into the moral depths that we're talking about? So we want to couple in many ways the mathematical depths with the moral implications and dimensions of what it means to produce data about human beings, about the world. And so I invite you now to join with me and go a little deeper than we've gone so far and put it into conversation with all of the other wonderful presentations, talks, and tutorials that people have been engaging in. The way that I started traveling down these depths is through my first research project as a doctoral student. I was trained in sociology, and my first project had to do with the social dimensions of stem cell research and regenerative medicine. And this is the first book that I finished in 2013, and there are a couple main things that still really sit with me and keep me up at night from this project. And there were two things that individuals said that I interviewed over the course of this research. One of which was a question. Why does everyone want me as a research subject and no one wants me as a patient? So this was articulated by a Black sickle cell patient with the sense that so many researchers wanted to incorporate him into various kinds of clinical trials and get samples and do research on him. But when it came to accessing basic forms of service in healthcare, he was actually criminalized. And that happens very common for the sickle cell community, where hospitals actually have protocols in place for when they become difficult. And so we want to think about this disjunction between the value, in this case, of Black bodies when it comes to research, or we can think of the value of Black data when it comes to Africa, but then who actually is benefiting from this research, right? And that's part of what Indaba is helping us to reconcile and correct in coursing this ship, is that those who are producing the data, right, who are getting mined for the data, not only should they benefit from it, but they should control it, they should engineer it, they should design it. The other thing that stayed with me from this project was something that another interviewee said. We want to be at the table and not on the table of stem cell research. Again, calling attention to the hypocrisy of being enrolled and valued in terms of clinical trials, but then in terms of voice, in terms of actual decision making and power shaping, they were marginalized. And so here, what we're getting at are questions of power and technology. So people science is not really people science. It's a kind of faux populism in this California research initiative, where there were a lot of buzzwords about this is for the people of California, but many of those constituencies in the state were not actually part of the decision-making of how this thing unfolded. So what's the alternative? One alternative that I conceived in this book is a notion of not people science, but Sankofa science. And here I'm drawing on the Adinkra proverb, it's okay, it's not wrong to go back and get what you've forgotten. It's this idea of how we incorporate a historical imaginary, a social consciousness into science as part of the design of science. How do we seed science and technology with an understanding of history, of sociology, of moral accountability? And so together we're going to think through how this idea of Sankofa science might apply also to the data sciences. But first, a story about power. Here we're not talking about data ethics, right? Or the impact of AI. We're talking about power and technology, how power shapes technology and vice versa. So very recently, I was going to give a talk to students at Harvey Mudd College, which is a STEM-focused school in Southern California. And on my way through the airport in New Jersey, I passed by two men having a conversation in the restaurant. One man to the other said, I just want someone I can push around, ... I was a little nosy at first, but I didn't stay around to hear the end of the conversation. And I filled it in my head that the conversation, that sentence could end in so many ways, right? I just want someone I can push around at work. Maybe he was looking through files of applicants and he wanted someone who would, answer his every beck and call. It could be someone he wanted to push around in dating or marriage. Swipe left, swipe right, right? Almost any context you think of, you have this newly emboldened sense of exercising domination over other people, right? It's given new license now in the world in we live. It's always been there. But people feel so much more comfortable to express it openly, right? In the middle of an airport. So what does this have to do with a talk about science and technology, right? It got me thinking about how this desire to push people around has been embedded in our technological imagination about what we want to design as our tools. I go back to this article from 1957 in Mechanics Illustrated. Here you see an article which says the robots are coming. When they do, you'll command a host of push-button servants. And then we zoom in because it's hard to see. In 1863, Abe Lincoln freed the slaves, but by 1965, slavery will be back. We'll all have personal slaves again. Don't be alarmed. We mean robot slaves. So much going on in this one little paragraph, isn't there? We could talk about it for an hour. One thing I want to point out is the desire to push people around or things around. There's a lot happening in this period, 1957, 1958, in terms of changes in the social milieu. Gender roles are shifting, the civil rights movement is ramping up. And so the expectation that you can push Black people around or push women around is being challenged. And so here you have this desire being embedded in our technological objects. If the women won't comb your hair and serve you meals in a jiffy, maybe a robot will. The other thing I want to zoom in on here is this one word. We'll all have personal slaves again. Again. So even in that one little word, it's hailing a particular public. It's saying who this is for. It's certainly not for those whose ancestors were enslaved the first time, right? It's for those who want personal slaves again. So already in the advertisement, in the hailing, it's telling you who this technology is for. Whose desire is it fulfilling? And so for us, we want to think about both this idea of this particular theory of power over others. And I want to really suggest that this is only one manifestation, one theory of power. This is not the only way that power operates. Thank you. Giving me some energy right there. There's another theory of power. It's not a vertical form of power, power over others to push people around. It's a horizontal form of power. It's when we empower one another. It's when my power does not rely on you being submissive. That is another theory of power that we are trying to cultivate together, so that we don't have to accept the dominant mode of power, but we have to recognize that power exists. And if we just do business as usual, the default setting of both society and technology is this dominant form of power will be the one to manifest. So if we want something different, we have to be very deliberate in cultivating another form of power, power with others. In doing so, and thinking about robots in particular, there's a few sort of foundational ideas I want to share with you. I'm trying to cram a lot into this little keynote. I'm giving you like a sociology of tech 101, so bear with me. We have this idea of technodeterminism, the idea that technology is the engine of society, that society is just trying to catch up to technology. And there's two forms that this technodeterminism takes. On the one hand, there are those who have crafted an idea of a techno-dystopia. The robots are coming to take the jobs. The robots are coming to kill us, right? Lots of good sci-fi around that. But there's another version of this, and that is that technology is going to save us, right? It's going to swoop in and actually save us from all of our health disparities and our political woes. It's going to save us from our own biases and prejudices, right? It's a techno-utopianism that's also deterministic, because it assumes that the technology is the one actually acting upon us and we are mere puppets. So whether it's this idea that technology is going to save us or slay us, these are both giving up power. They are both giving up our agency in terms of our own role in the design of these technical systems. That we don't just submit to the default settings, to the things that others have created, but we actually try to embed our own values and imaginary into these structures. So we want to move beyond a techno-determinism. Now we have this wonderful theme this year, right? Sauti Yetu. And when we talk about voice and voice in AI, I want to suggest that one of the things we have to do is, yes, acknowledge that diversity in tech is important, but it is actually not the end-all, be-all. It's not the answer to all of our problems. I'll give you this example. This man pictured here is a computer scientist, and he created an app. And one of the things he was considering doing was, for the voice of his app, he wanted to change it up a little bit, right? Rather than have the white female voice that is the voice of all of the assistants, right? He wanted to have a black male voice in his app. And even though he wanted to do it as a black man in computer science, he felt that the market would reject it. He felt that people wouldn't want to use it, right? And so you see that when we talk about change and changing the direction, yes, diversity is important, but if you are a diverse person in tech, but you don't feel the power to go against these market trends or these social norms, then that diversity is only going to take you so far. So we have to think about, what do we have to change beyond the workforce? We have to also think about these larger social and economic norms that people feel that they have to submit to, where even the voice embedded in AI is not representative, right? And someone who's diverse in AI doesn't feel the power to change it. And so when we look at this context that's reproducing these social stigmas, social prejudices, we have so many examples, and I could give a talk full of these, but I'll just offer one that you might recognize. If you go to your search and you type in professional hairstyles, you get images on your right. You type in unprofessional hairstyles, you get images on your left. See a pattern emerging, right? Except for a few exceptions. You have Queen Bee on your right. You have the lady from Hunger Games on your left. Few exceptions, but the exceptions only underscore the rule, right? And so we want to think about how, in some ways, this presents a problem and an opportunity. The way that I see it, our technological systems are mirroring back to us our own patterns, our own prejudices. They present a clear reflection on many things that we refuse to acknowledge when another person tells us, right? And so we know, for example, in at least, I think, 2 states in the US, the legislatures have had to pass laws that say that you can't discriminate against black women's natural hair. They had to pass a whole law for that, because it was happening so commonly, and we felt that we had to whiten ourselves to present ourselves respectably. And yet, people have been saying this for ages, but you have here technical systems that are saying, nope, look, this is what you think, And this goes for many other patterns that people refuse to acknowledge. So I see it in many ways as our robots reflecting back at us the things that we need to acknowledge and deal with. A little closer to home. It just so happens we're meeting at the time of the census. Is that a coincidence, or was that planned? And we're meeting at a time when people are debating the merits of this Kenyan AllinOne ID, Huduma Namba. What is this? It's not your average ID, right? It's quite comprehensive, we might say, euphemistically. It includes fingerprints, hand geometry, earlobe geometry, retina and iris patterns, toe impression, voice waves, blood typing, photograph, or such other biological attributes, without which it will be impossible to get a passport, apply for a driver's license, register a mobile phone number, register as a voter, pay taxes, get health care, and the list goes on and on. And so people are debating this. Many millions of people have already registered, but there's quite an extensive debate happening, and you can look under the hashtag resist Huduma Namba to get a feel for what the debates are. And so for us sitting in this room who are in the business of data collection, production, and research, what do we think of this? Is this part of our conversation? Do we have any responsibility to weigh in? Is the collection of data in this way a straightforward good? Is this something outside of our purview? Is it something someone else should worry about? These are questions that I hope that we'll be able to wrestle with. Part of that conversation, I think, has to reckon with the history of data collection in every country, by all nation states. We know that Trump administration tried to include a citizen question on our census, and people rose up against that because it was clear what the intent behind that citizen question was. In every country, we have to think more critically about data production, collection, research, and the use of this data. Data doesn't exist in a bubble or a vacuum. Even when we think about the debate happening here, people online, if you go to that hashtag, are invoking this history of Kenyan passbooks. Not to say that the card today is exactly the same as the passbook. It's not to make this straightforward, draw this straightforward linear connection, but it's invoking it to say this history impacts how people feel about this process of data collection. And it simply underscores the fact that this idea of more data is not a straightforward good. And as a scientific community, it's, I think, our responsibility to have a more somber and critical reflection about this idea of more data. We need more data. Sure, in many cases we certainly do, and that data can be used for good, right? To expose injustices and inequity. But it doesn't necessarily do that, right? And this is that duplicity that we want to actually be able to wrap our heads around. There's a book I would suggest that people look at if you have it, that calls out one of our sponsors, IBM. There should be books written on all of them, I think. IBM and the Holocaust. Here we learn that much has already been written about using contemporary art disciplines and medical scientific approaches by the Nazi regime to manage the economic value of man. Besides disciplines such as eugenics and statistics, the new prospect was seen in automation, of gathering and sorting of information, which became an instrument for mass extermination of undesirable minorities who allegedly jeopardized the national body of Nazi Germany, Jews, Roma, homosexuals, and other minorities, were systematically separated as racially inferior, unproductive, and nationally useless. Systematic recording and bureaucratic exclusion of Jews began in Germany with the census of 1933, tracing their biological and social conditions. From 1938 onwards, wherever the Germans invaded foreign countries, police and security services immediately started to record, count, and separate Jews and other inferior minorities. All territories seized by Nazi Germany became acquainted with a new technology of punch cards and a card sorting system in order to automize human destruction. So my question for us is, how do we, as a scientific community, reckon with this history? Should we? And how should we learn about this, quote, new technology to automize human destruction? Is it outside of our purview? Do we reinforce the bubble that is only about the technical and say this history doesn't matter? Or should it be part of our pedagogy, part of our learning, that we learn about the history of deadly data? Not to say that all data collection will necessarily be deadly, right? That's its own determinism. It's not to say that this is the only history, that data has not been used to actually expose these crimes. But why do we scrub, clean, sanitize, euphemize the role that data collection production has had in extermination at the extreme, but many other forms of oppression? Is it our responsibility? Right? Something interesting about this period of Nazism is that we learned that the division of labor that separated complete operations into factions of the whole, that means all of these different bureaucratic offices, allowed thousands of people to participate in a massive bureaucracy of death without feeling responsible. That is, in our collective imaginary, we just think about the actual like Nazi soldiers and guards. They're the bad guys, right? But this extermination required the postal service. It required the statistics office. It required doctors and scientists played a key role. All of these different factions, because people were able to, bracket what they were doing and not think about what's going on over there. They just did their work. They just punched their, clocked in and clocked out. I'm not responsible for that. It allowed the whole thing to happen, right? Precisely because people didn't feel responsible. It was someone else's job. I don't make the decisions. It's a way of not owning our own power and responsibility in these larger systems. And so let's not repeat the past, right? Part of changing the direction of this ship of science and technology is to say it's not someone else's responsibility. Right? We, in our expertise, have a role to play. Who, after all, are designing these databases? And so I give you this example. And I like to offer examples that I can use with my teenagers, I can use with my grandma, because for me, it's not sufficient that only the experts can talk about this and relate to this. This implicates everyone. So I need to be able to communicate in a way that my sons can understand and my grandma can understand. And so this is an example that I use. It's an example of a very simple object, right? Of a park bench. And this bench is located in Berkeley, California, which is where I went to graduate school. I was not living at Berkeley at the time. I was living in Boston, which is freezing. And it was February, so I was back here in California, and I wanted to soak in some sunshine for 20 minutes between meetings. And I wanted to lay down on this bench, but I couldn't lay down on the bench because whoever designed it put these very convenient armrests on the bench. Except that maybe if I lost 20 pounds, I could like slip in between the rails or something. Now, why are these armrests there? So we can think about all the technical, instrumental, functional reasons, right? They actually let you place your arm elbows there, right? If you're elderly, it could help you get up and down easier, perhaps. When I was 9 months pregnant, it could come in handy, right? But my mind went to where some of you are thinking, some of you called out, that It might also be that it's to deter people from sleeping on the bench, right? And to get homeless people out of sight, right? And so a footnote to this example is that this is located in the San Francisco Bay Area. And one thing you may know is that with the growth of the tech industry, the tech boom, the homeless crisis has also grown in proportion. So here you have innovation on the one hand, growing in proportion to inequity on the other. One statistic says that 1 in 3 school children in Silicon Valley are homeless. And they have a euphemism, they're houseless, they have a housing insecurity. So here we learn that if we just do business as usual, and we just focus on innovation and tech and economic growth, the default setting is that it's going to exacerbate inequalities, right? If we do business as usual. So that's a footnote to know that the crisis, the homeless issue in the area is exponential. And there's some cute little stores in front of this bench, and I could imagine, as I did then, oh, maybe they don't want people laying on the bench, all right? And the reason I'm going to expand on this example is because I want us to think beyond the intentions of a designer, a programmer, a bench constructor. That the bench designer doesn't have to hate homeless people for this bench to have an effect. The way that the inequity is structured, the way that the bench is designed is going to have this effect whether or not that designer means to have that effect. So sometimes people say, well, do you think that the programmers or the computer, do you think that they're racist? It doesn't matter if they're racist. If the effects of the technology have that effect, it's racist, right? And so when we think about this example, I went online and did a little searching, got a little paranoid. Oh boy, the benches are coming. I found single occupancy benches in Helsinki. So only one booty at a time, and don't let it be too big, all right? I found caged benches in France. In this particular town, the mayor put the benches out, and the people in the town were so appalled, within 24 hours, they rallied together and had the benches removed, which tells us that we don't just have to accept discriminatory designs. We don't just have to take what people give us, right? If we work together and collectively organize, and this will be a theme we come back to, we can actually redress this. We can actually push back and resist against these discriminatory designs. But my favorite bench of all is the metered bench. Because with this bench, you actually have to go ahead and put money in for the spikes to retreat for about 15 minutes. And then I think a little ding, 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 and then it lets you know. You got to put more money in, all right? So in this case, you'll be happy to know that it was designed by a German artist to get us to think about these questions of design and more broadly about the metering of social life, the metering of public life, the fact that we have so many things that we call for the public, right? It's nominally for everyone, but because of how we design it, we've actually designed and embedded forms of exclusion and harm into the object. Now think about it. If this can happen with something so simple as a bench, right? That doesn't have a lot of different aspects to it. Imagine for much more complex things that we design. How many values, assumptions, biases are embedded into our structures, whether it's our physical architecture or our algorithmic architecture. We have to think about the spikes that are there, whether or not we intend for them to be spikes. In this case, this is a technical fix for a social problem, homelessness. But we create technical fixes for all kinds of social problems, whether it's in healthcare or employment. We say, rather than deal with the underlying issues, let's create something that basically gets them out of our sight. We don't want to see those homeless people. right? So let's think critically about when we're asked to fix a problem with technology and whether that's actually the best course of action. Perhaps there's something more fundamental that we can also be contributing to in the process. What are the values, thinking about your own designs? What are the assumptions, the biases? Post-intentional. Whether you intend for them to have these effects, it's still our responsibility to think ahead, like a chess player, to imagine who could possibly be harmed by these spikes, who could possibly be excluded through our designs. Again, MLK, true compassion is more than flinging a coin to a beggar. It comes to see that an edifice which produces beggars needs restructuring. Rather than just get the problem out of sight, what fundamentally needs restructuring? And so now I'm going to switch to notes so I stay on time. I really hope I do. But here we go. There are 3 takeaways for the remainder of the talk. And I hope that I've laid some foundation for you to appreciate these takeaways. The first takeaway is this: racism, and you can also add many other isms, sexism, colonialism, right? All of these isms, but I'm going to focus on racism. Why? Because technology is saturated in a post-racial ideology. The idea that through technology we will bypass all of these long-standing problems. So here is why I want to underscore: racism is productive. Not in the sense of being good. That's not what I mean by productive. But in the literal capacity of racism to produce things of value to some, even as it wreaks havoc on others. All of us are taught to think of racism as an aberration, a glitch, an accident, an isolated incident, a bad apple, in the backwoods, outdated, rather than innovative, systemic, diffuse, and attached incident. The entire orchard, in the ivory tower, forward-looking, productive, again, not in the sense of being good. In sociology, we like to say race is socially constructed, but we often fail to state the corollary, that racism constructs. Secondly, I'd like us to think about the way that race and technology shape one another. More and more people today are accustomed to thinking about the ethical and social impact of technology. But this is only half of the story. Social norms, values, structures all exist prior to any given tech development. So it's not simply the impact of technology, but the social inputs that make some inventions appear inevitable and desirable. Which leads to a third provocation, that imagination is a contested field of action, not an ephemeral afterthought that we have the luxury to dismiss or romanticize, but a resource, a battleground, an input and an output of technology and social order. In fact, we should acknowledge this, that most people are forced to live in an imagination, in someone else's imagination. And one of the things we have to come to grips with is how the nightmares that many people are forced to endure are actually the underside of elite fantasies about efficiency, profit, and control. Racism, among other axes of domination, helps to produce this fragmented imagination, misery for some and monopoly for others. This means that for those of us who want to construct a different social reality, one that is grounded in joy and justice, we can't only critique the underside, But we also have to wrestle with the deep investments, the desire even for social domination. I just want someone I can push around. So that's the takeaway. Now let's turn to some specifics, beginning with a relatively new app called Citizen, which will send you real-time crime alerts based on a curated selection of calls to the police. It also offers a way for users to report, live stream, and comment on purported crimes via the app. And it also shows you incidents as red dots on a map, so you can avoid particular areas, which is a slightly less racialized version of other apps called Ghetto Tracker and Sketch Factor, which use public data to help people avoid supposedly dangerous neighborhoods. Now you're probably thinking, what could possibly go wrong with these apps? I mean, in the age of barbecue Beckys and all the other white women who call the police on black people cooking, walking, breathing out of place. It turns out even a Stanford-educated environmental scientist living in the San Francisco Bay Area, liberal bubble that it is as an ambassador for the carceral police state, calling the police, in this case, on a cookout at Lake Merritt because the people were using the wrong grill. It's worth noting, too, that the app, Citizen, was originally called the less chill name, Vigilante. And in its rebranding, it also moved away from encouraging people to stop crime, but rather now to avoid it. As one member of the New York City Council put it, quote, crime is now at historic lows in the city. But because residents are constantly being bombarded with push notifications of crime, they believe the city is going to hell in a handbasket. Not only is this categorically false, it's distracting people from very real public safety issues like reckless driving or the rising opioid use that don't show up on the app. What's more, what's important to our discussion, I think, is that Citizen and other tech fixes for social problems are not simply about technology's impact on society, but also about how social norms and values shape what tools are imagined necessary in the first place. This dynamic is what I take up in two new books. The first examines the interplay between race, automation, and machine bias more broadly, as an extension of older forms of racial domination. In this work, I'm concerned with who and what are fixed in place to enable innovation in science and technology. How are novel technologies deployed in carceral approaches to governing life well beyond the domain of policing? But also, to what end do we imagine? How can transformation of our political, cultural, and social norms work towards collective forms of freedom? And how might technoscience be appropriated and reimagined for more liberatory ends? The second is an edited volume on the carceral dimensions of technology across a wide array of social arenas, from more traditional sites like policing and prisons to less obvious contexts like the retail industry, financial technologies, and the digital service economy. Both of these books are wrestling in different ways with how technology captivates in the sense of fascinating, charming, and bewitching, while also potentially subduing and subjugating people. To wrestle with this duplicity, first we have to pierce through the fancy rhetoric and buzzwords of tech utopianism. Exhibit A. The financial tech industry intent on capturing our imagination with all kinds of socially conscious promises. As this article reports, expanding access to bank credit has long been a goal of international organizations, government, and industry, united by the goal of, quote, financial inclusion or banking the unbanked. This agenda allows people to use mobile apps to transfer cash and make payments on cell phones without a bank account and get easy access to credit, and valorizes the role of markets to improve people's lives. People once excluded from credit, the narrative goes, can now access capital to improve their short and long-term prospects. But the question for us is this evidence of Silicon Savannah, as Kenya has been dubbed, or of algorithmic colonialism? As one Nairobian put it, these apps give you money gently and then they come for your neck. While another said that the apps are enslaving people, as many take out loans with one mobile service to repay existing debts for another lending service. A debt treadmill that is hard to escape. As the authors of this article put it, quote, Kenyans are being driven into circuits of financial capital that are premised not, as the marketing would have it, on empowerment, but on the profitability of perpetual debt. Two of the most prominent FinTech apps are Tala and Branch. From their California headquarters, these firms export Silicon Valley's curious nexus of technology, finance, and developmentalism. Quickly downloaded onto Kenya's proliferating smartphones and utilizing the country's ubiquitous mobile money transfer system, these apps mine people's devices and social media accounts for signs of their credit worthiness. While their lending algorithms are closely guarded secrets, industry insiders suggest an ambitious effort to track everyday behavior and social relations. While these firms offer little transparency to the public, they tell investors that money is pouring in. Tala has raised more than 109 million US dollars, while Branch has received nearly 260 million US dollars from investors keen to capitalize on poor people's debt and data. Each time a loan is taken out, more user data is harvested, allowing companies to develop better predictions on the rates of repayment of a given customer. Finally, as a sociologist, what I find especially disturbing is how the FinTech sector capitalizes on the social stigma associated with debt. Another of these apps, Okash, took this logic of stigmatization to an extreme, harvesting users' contacts and calling their bosses, parents, and friends to shame defaulters into repaying. And this stigma has real material effects when not only the loan appraisers, but would-be employers are demanding to see people's credit reports, in which many borrowers have already been blacklisted. As sociologist Tamara Nopper writes in the chapter in Captivating Technology, these marketplace lenders predict and produce digital character, which is a profile used to make inferences about people's credibility, reliability, industriousness, responsibility, and morality. Digital character, in turn, is a pillar of our scored society, in which being scored significantly shapes economic life chances. A question for those of us in this room: are we responsible for speaking back to these computational infrastructures? Those called on to create the algorithms that actually do the scoring. How are we implicated in practices of predatory inclusion when it comes to tech promises more broadly? These are questions I'm going to come back to in just a second, but what I want to underscore is predatory exclusion is promiscuous in terms of ideology. It can run from a kind of authoritarianism where we see China collaborating with Zimbabwe to mine people's biometric data to make its algorithms more representative, there's facial recognition technology more able to see Black people, all the way to a neoliberal ideology that we see with the FinTech sector that is predicated on free choice and a market, free market ideas. And so this runs the political gamut. So here I'm going to pause and just give my voice a break and also give you guys a little sci-fi interlude, if you will, to get us thinking more broadly about what this global dimension of techno-utopian imaginaries. I'll go back, hold on. So we try that again with the volume. So this is a very short clip from a film called Sleep Dealers, and we'll see if the volume works. If not, we can jump on. Okay, I'm going to try again.
So here's a clip. It's about 3 minutes long. In this scene, you'll see the character as he crosses the border for the first time. So you'll see he's in Mexico, but he comes to America in a new way.
Cerca de la colonia donde vivía, en las afueras de la ciudad, estaban las infomaquilas, los sleep dealers.
Este es el sueño americano. Le damos a los Estados Unidos lo que siempre han querido. Todo el trabajo sin los trabajadores. José está en un matadero en Iowa y María es niñera de una niñita en Washington. Ustedes tres van a estar en una chambota en San Diego. Muchacho, enchúfate. Tu futuro empieza hoy.
Español.
Okay. All right, so there's two things that I want to point out, and I encourage people to see the full film. It's called Sleep Dealers. Two things. One, embodiment. When things are called automated, there are still likely humans behind the scenes who are allowing for that automation to happen. And their labor is invisibilized and often subjugated. And we think about our experience online, content moderators, right? There's a great Netflix film I encourage you to watch called The Cleaners, which is about content moderation in the Philippines. And two books, one called Behind the Screen and one called Ghost Workers, that talks about the work conditions and the experience of those who make automation possible. The second point is that this film illustrates how the fantasy of some on the other side of the border is predicated on the nightmare of others. So how should we understand the duplicity of technological fixes, purported solutions that nevertheless reinforce, even deepen existing hierarchies. In terms of popular discourse, what got me started along this research was the proliferation of headlines and hot takes about so-called racist robots. A first wave of stories seemed to be shocked at the prospect that, in Langdon Winner's terms, artifacts have politics. A second wave seemed less surprised. Well, of course, technology inherits its creators' biases. And now I think we've entered a phase of attempts to override or address the default settings of so-called racist robots, for better or worse. And one of the challenges we face is how to meaningfully differentiate technologies that are used to differentiate us. The combination of coded bias and imagined objectivity is what I term the new Jim Code, innovation that enables social containment while appearing fairer than discriminatory practices of a previous era. This is a riff off of Michelle Alexander's analysis in her book, The New Jim Crow, which considers how the reproduction of racist forms of social control in successive institutional forms, that is slavery, Jim Crow, ghettoization, mass incarceration in the US context, entails a crucial socio-technical component that not only hides the nature of domination, but allows it to penetrate every facet of social life under the guise of progress. This formulation, as I highlight here, is directly related to a number of other cousin concepts by Brown, Broussard, Eubanks, Noble, and others. And what I hope is that some of you in this room will take this and situate it and decide about concepts that are more historically situated in your own countries and histories of oppression. The new Jim Code is situated in a hybrid literature that I think of as race-critical code studies. And I would encourage you to take a screenshot of this, because my homework for you is to read at least one of these books before the next Indaba. This approach is not only concerned with the impacts of technology, but its production, and particularly how race and racism enter the process. Black software, for example, will be out in the fall, so it's not out yet, but I expect it to be very relevant to our conversations. Just two quick illustrations on here. Safiya Noble's Algorithms of Oppression argues that racist and sexist Google search results, like pornographic images returned when you type in the phrase black girls, grow out of a corporate logic of either willful neglect or a profit imperative that makes money from racism and sexism. In a different vein, Simone Brown, in her book Dark Matters, examines how the history of surveillance technologies reflects and reproduces distorted notions of blackness, explaining that, in her words, surveillance is nothing new to black folks. From slave ships and slave patrols to airport security checkpoints and stop and frisk practices, she points to, quote, the facticity of surveillance in black life, challenging a techno-deterministic approach that only looks at technology's impacts. She argues that instead of seeing surveillance as something inaugurated by new technologies, to see it as ongoing is to insist that we factor in how racism and anti-blackness undergird and sustain the intersecting surveillances of our present order. So as we think about how anti-blackness gets encoded in and exercised through automated systems, I consider four aspects to the new Jim Code that fall along a kind of spectrum: engineered inequity, default discrimination, coded exposure, and techno-benevolence. And for the sake of time, I'm just gonna I'll give you examples of the last probably two. And it kind of goes from the most obvious cases, the things where people are just, actually trying to create, control and surveillance, to the things that seem more beneficent, that are done in the name of good technology. And so I'm going to skip some of it because I'm kind of running on time, but it goes in depth in Race After Technology in the book. There's these kind of predictive policing algorithms, things that try to produce the risk scores of individuals, whether they're going to commit another crime or not. They have been shown through research to have not only be incorrect in their predictions across the board, but they predict that white people are not going to commit crimes when they do, and they predict that black people are going to commit crimes when they don't. So their risk profile is actually wrong. So I'm going to skip to coded exposure, because this one I think names this tension between ongoing surveillance of racialized populations and calls for digital recognition and inclusion, the desire to literally be seen by technology. Linking historical precedents with contemporary techniques, different forms of exposure serve as a touchstone for considering how the act of viewing something or someone may actually put the object of vision at risk. And what I like to underscore is that it's not only in the process of being out of sight, as the first image shows, but also in the process of being too centered that racialized groups are made vulnerable. In Alondra Nelson's terms, this is a dialectic of neglect and surveillance at work. So being included in systems is not simply a positive recognition, but it can be a form of unwanted exposure. So here I'm going to pause for another 2-minute clip if we can. Let's see if this one works.
Hello? Motion sensors. Motioning. Motioning. Please sense me.
One other thing. Lem mentioned that there's something weird going on with the motion sensors in the lab.
Oh, yeah. We replaced all the sensors in the building with a new state-of-the-art system that's going to save money. It works by detecting light reflected off the skin.
Well, Lem says it doesn't work at all.
Lem's wrong. It does work. Although there is a problem. It doesn't seem to see black people.
The system doesn't see black people?
I know. Weird, huh?
That's more than weird, Veronica. That's basically, well, racist.
The company's position is that it's actually the opposite of racist because it's not targeting black people, it's just ignoring them. They insist the worst people can call it is indifferent.
Nothing. We never should have let that white guy off.
We're 8 black men in an elevator. Of course the white guy's gonna get off. Veronica? Oh, God, this looks way too aggressive.
No, it's okay. I think I know why you're all here. Well, most of you.
I have something prepared. Veronica, you are a terrific boss.
Thank you, Lem. I'll take it from here. Let me start by apologizing on behalf of Viridian for this inexcusable situation.
I laid into Veronica pretty good. I figured it was my only shot, so I took the gloves off.
Oh, that sounds great, Lem. Sounds like you gave the company a really strong message.
Oh, yeah. She said they're working 24/7 to make things right. Can you believe this?
I know, isn't it great? We all get our own free white guys.
You like it?
Yeah. Hey, Todd's the best. He anticipates everything I need. Plus, he picked up my dry cleaning. Oh, and he got this kink out in the neck.
Really?
Mm-hmm.
My white guy sucks.
Well, maybe you're just not using yours right.
Yeah, maybe it's on you, dude.
Shut up, Stu.
I got the worst black guy.
It turned out Lem had also been thinking about the money issue, and he put together some interesting numbers to show us. And then we all went to speak to management in a language they could understand, within a margin of error of plus or minus 1%. And so, if the company keeps hiring white people to follow black people, to follow white people, to follow black people, by
Thursday, June 27th, 2013.
every person on Earth will be working for us. And we don't have the parking for that.
All right, so Sometimes comedy can convey something better than 100 books. And so this show, to me, brilliantly depicts how a superficial corporate diversity ethos, prioritization of efficiency over equity, and the default whiteness of tech development work together to ensure innovation produces containment. And so if it wasn't clear, that idea of the separate water fountains, which was a hallmark of, segregation era apartheid in the US and elsewhere, finds a new form in this kind of manual water fountain because Black people can't use the automated one. So finally, the last example is around techno-benevolence. Some of the most interesting developments, I think, are those we can think of as, tech for good, that aims to address bias in various ways. Take, for example, new artificial intelligence techniques for vetting job applicants. A company called HireView aims to reduce unconscious bias and promote diversity in the workplace by using AI-powered programs that analyze recorded interviews of prospective employees. It uses thousands of data points, including verbal and nonverbal cues like facial expression, posture, and vocal tone, and compares job seekers' scores to those of existing top-performing employees to decide who to flag as a desirable hire and who to reject. And needless to say, this is coming in the wake of huge applicant pools, human resources offices are overtaxed, and hundreds of companies have signed on. Another value added, according to HireView, is that there's a lot that a human interviewer misses that AI can keep track of to make, quote, data-driven talent decisions. After all, the problem of employment discrimination is widespread and well documented. So the logic goes, wouldn't this be more reason to outsource decisions to AI? Well, a study by a Princeton team of computer scientists examined whether a popular algorithm trained on human writing online exhibited the same racially biased tendencies that psychologists have documented among humans. In particular, they found that the algorithm associated white-sounding names with pleasant words and black-sounding names with unpleasant ones. And I can talk a little bit about the social science audits that this is predicated on. So too with gender-coded words and names, as Amazon learned last year when its hiring algorithm was found discriminating against women. Nevertheless, it should be clear why technical fixes that claim to bypass human biases are so desirable. If only there was a way to slay centuries of racist and sexist demons with a social justice bot. Beyond desirable, more like magical. Magical for employers, perhaps, looking to streamline the grueling work of recruitment, but a curse for many job seekers. Whereas proponents describe a very human-like interaction, those who are on the hunt for jobs recount a very different experience. Applicants are frustrated not only by the lack of human contact, but also because they have no idea how they're being evaluated and why they're repeatedly rejected. One job seeker described questioning every small movement and micro-expression and feeling a heightened sense of worthlessness because, quote, the company couldn't even assign a person for a few minutes. As the headline shows, your next interview could be with a racist robot. Bringing us back to that problem space we started with. Though it's worth noting here that some job seekers are already developing ways to subvert the system by trading answers to employers' tests and creating fake applications as informal audits of their own. In fact, there was one HR employee for a major company who recommended that we slip the words Oxford or Cambridge into our CV with invisible white ink to pass the automated screening. In terms of a more collective response, a federation of European trade unions called UNI Global Union has developed a charter of digital rights for workers touching on automated and AI-based decisions to be included in bargaining agreements. One of the most heartening developments to me is that tech industry employees themselves have increasingly been speaking out against the most egregious forms of corporate collusion with state-sanctioned racism in the form of ICE contracts, surveillance, and military contracts. An important but limited development. I would encourage you to go follow the hashtag #TechWon'tBuildIt and think about how Indaba might relate to this movement. And as this article published by Science for the People reminds us, Contrary to popular narratives, organizing among technical workers has a vibrant history, including engineers and technicians in the 60s and 70s who fought professionalism, individualism, and reformism to contribute to radical labor organizing. The current tech workers movement can draw from these past organizing strategies and challenges in learning to navigate the contradictions and complexities of organizing in tech today. In a more collaborative vein, local initiatives like Data for Black Lives and the Detroit Community Tech Project offer an even more expansive approach, similar to the vision developing here at Indaba. The former brings together people working across a number of agencies and organizations in a proactive approach to tech justice, especially at the policy level. And the latter develops and uses technology rooted in community needs, offering support to grassroots networks doing data justice research, including what they call in Detroit host discotheques, which stand for Discovering Technology, which are multimedia mobile neighborhood workshop fairs that can be adapted in other locales. Data for Black Lives, too, has been supporting a number of community initiatives to resist the incorporation of algorithmic decision-making to identify, for example, at-risk youth in which the educational system and the police system have been colluding. And then, in terms of what I consider a more emancipatory approach still, I want to mention the Design Justice Initiative and also the Our Data Bodies Playbook, which introduces a set of tools for diagnosing, dealing with, and healing the injustices of pervasive and punitive data collection and data-driven systems. The playbook contains in-depth guidelines for facilitating workshops and group activities, plus tools, tip sheets, reflection pieces, and rich stories crafted from in-depth interviews with different communities. And the aim of these projects is to engender power, not paranoia, when it comes to technology. Toward that end, and as I close, I want to mention the words of the late legal and critical race scholar Derek A. Bell, who encouraged a radical assessment of reality through creative methods and racial reversals. He insisted that to see things as they really are, you must imagine them for what they might be, which is why I think that the arts and humanities, including the social sciences, have to be vital to this discussion. One of my favorite examples of a racial reversal in this Bell tradition is a parody project that begins by subverting the anti-Black logics embedded in new high-tech approaches to crime prevention. Instead of using predictive policing techniques to forecast street crime, the white-collar early warning system flips the script by creating a heat map that flags city blocks where financial crimes are likely to occur. The system not only brings the hidden but no less deadly crimes of capitalism into view, but it includes an app that alerts users when they enter high-risk areas to encourage citizen policing and awareness. Taking it one step further, the development team is working on a facial recognition program to flag individuals who are likely perpetrators. And the training set used to design the algorithm includes the profile photos of 7,000 corporate executives downloaded from LinkedIn. Not surprisingly, the average face of a criminal is white and male. To be sure, creative exercises like this are only comical if we ignore that all of its features are drawn directly from actually existing proposals and practices in the real world, including the use of facial images to predict criminality. By deliberately and inventively upsetting the status quo in this manner, analysts can better understand and expose the many forms of discrimination embedded in and enabled by technology. As it turns out, the process of refashioning the relationship between race and tech may entail actual fashion. Hyphen Labs is an international team of women of color experimenting with a wide array of subversive designs, including earrings for recording police altercations, and visors and other clothing that prevent facial recognition. Here we come to appreciate the creative, even beautiful dimensions of resistance. So my final proposition is this, and now I'm really closing. If, as I've described, inequity is woven into the very fabric of all of our societies, then each twist, coil, and code is a chance for us to weave new patterns, practices, and politics. The vastness of the problem will be its undoing once we accept that we are pattern makers. Once we accept that we are pattern makers. As human beings, we see the patterns all around us. We see it in our handiwork, in our crafts. We are pattern makers. We see it in our fresh hairstyles. We are pattern makers. But as so long as we just inherit patterns of old, we just take the spiked bench that someone else has created and keep using it, then we're going to keep reproducing the same problems. And so the challenge for us is, how do we empower ourselves as a community to not just code switch and fit into the tech world, but to rewrite the codes, rewrite the values, assumptions, and worldviews that go into building our material infrastructure so that it reflects our highest concerns and values. And so that, I want to thank you for your attention. I'm sorry for going over time, and I look forward to some one-on-one conversations. Thank you. I have a few minutes? Okay. All right. So you gotta make it quick. So you can ask a question or you can just post a reflection too. All right, let's go. 1, 2, 3, and then I think there's a 4, and then go. Yeah. Okay. And if my answer, if I think it's going to be too long, I'll say we'll do it one-on-one too. All right.
Will probably in future still be greatly dependent upon data availability. And I'm thinking back to your first couple of slides, and all that comes to mind is the Tuskegee atrocity. And how do we as scientists conform to GDPR compliance with data controlling and, anonymity? How do we protect countries like Sierra Leone and the rest of Africa when our Ebola samples are exported and hidden in laboratories for big pharma profit? How do we keep this socially, racially, and African conscientized to protect the interests of our people? Yeah. At the same time, there's this question of building technology and finding solutions and using machine learning to just find solutions that are affordable and implementable, and all I see is Tuskegee. All I see is that horrible study and those men that died.
Yeah, I mean, it's such a powerful question, and it's not a question, one, that should be answered by an expert that helicopters in from the outside. This is a question for collective deliberation and should be part and parcel of what I think you should be debating and considering as a community. One thing I'll note as you refer to the Tuskegee syphilis experiment, one of the very simple things that gets erased, even in how we call that, the Tuskegee experiment, which is this 40-year so-called clinical trial on black men in Alabama. After a treatment for syphilis was found, they were denied that treatment. Even in how we call it, by the name of the town in which the men lived, we erase who the agents were who carried this out. That in fact, this was the U.S. Public Health Service study. And so how even we name it historically in our memory, I think we have to go back and put the agents of this back into the conversation. Because when we only look at who is harmed by this, and we don't look at all of the careers built upon this atrocity, then we are likely to reproduce it. We think that, oh, it's something of old, it can never happen. Now we have IRB. Oh, we're good. We just need to fill out some forms and everything is okay. But let us remember that it wasn't just people harmed by it, but a whole host of people who benefited from the denial of treatment of these people. And so the professional communities sanctioned this. It was business as usual. These are people going in and out of work for 40 years, publishing papers in the top papers. Everyone knew that this was happening. It was not happening in the dark. So that tells us that, yes, we need to be worried about the things that might be happening in the dark today, but there are likely things happening in the broad day of light that we're not paying attention to because we can see it, and we become inured to it. We think, oh, that's just business as usual. That's just people doing their jobs. Oh, that's someone else's responsibility. So let us also pay attention to the things that are right under our noses that might in 40 years be looked back upon, and people say, how could they have done that? And I think that's one of the lessons we have to take from Tuskegee.
Yeah, hello. Yeah.
Yep.
Okay.
Yes.
So you made a point about creating services that benefit one class of people and alienate another class of people. So my question is, assuming that you have the best intentions, like you want to, you don't want to be discriminatory, like is it possible to create something that will have like the best of both, like will benefit people without alienating anyone? And to put it concretely, assuming that you are the one running like a micro-lending service. So how would you balance making sure that your customers benefit, like they're able to gain prosperity from borrowing from you, but that you still have people paying you back and you're making your profit and you're able to pay your employees and you're able to give investors their returns and you yourself do not go bankrupt? Like how could you balance everything without like alienating anyone in the process?
Yeah, I think that it's a $1 million question. I'm sure many people are wrestling with in your head. You're thinking about the work that you're doing. And again, there's no prescription, there's no 10-point plan. Okay, if you follow this checklist, just tick these boxes, make sure you've done all of that, and then you can be sure you have an ethically sound, politically robust, socially conscious initiative. I think as soon as we get to the point where we think we have a formula for this, that it's easy, that we can just tick some boxes, then we fooled ourselves. And so one of the first things to do is think about how to build into your research or your initiative a feedback loop that's iterative, that's constantly questioning, collaborating, and connecting with the communities that it's supposedly meant to help. It can start out helping, but then in the process of being rolled out, it can have some effects that you didn't think of. But if you're not in close relationship with these communities, one, it's either not going to get back to you through this feedback loop, or it's going to be easy to dismiss because you're the expert and they're just the user. What I say is that if we call people users, they're likely to be used. And so let's think about people not as just kind of getting services, but as constituents. And what we have right now with the tech industry is many of these design decisions are really public policy decisions in disguise. That is, the implications of what people are designing are having all kinds of policy, public implications, but nobody voted for them. So you have, they're working with no mandate. And so similarly, when we think about your own role, who are you accountable to? What community are you in relation with so you can get the understanding and that it's iterative and ongoing? There's no easy formula that you can just say, if I do this, then I'm golden. And so let us become uneasy with our own self-assuredness that what we're doing is ethically sound, politically robust.
Hello?
Yes, I don't see you. Yes.
Yeah. So my friend there sort of stole my thunder because one of my questions is around discrimination, because it's not obvious to me that discrimination is always a bad thing, especially in business. From a banking context, do you think, what do you think is a good way then to quantify risk with customers and giving credit?
Yeah.
And then you had a quote there, there was a Kenyan gentleman who said these apps treat you
gently, but come back and get you.
Yeah, like you essentially become a slave.
Yeah.
I'm sensing a bit of self-exculpation from him.
Okay.
Because don't you think we can say a lot about educating people on how to better manage debt and credit instead of thinking that the apps are oppressive and evil.
Yeah. So sure, two parts of the question. I'll give short answers and then we'll connect afterwards and get into more detail. Two things, how to quantify risk. And I'm glad you asked that because so many of these tools are meant to identify, quantify, predict risk. And what I want to suggest is this. If I had a dream team and I was thinking about how to quantify risk, I would not turn my lens on those individuals who are more or less risky. I would turn my lens on the institutions that are risk producing. This is a different way of thinking about risk that does not fall on simply the shoulders of individuals, which is a very hyper-capitalist way of thinking, but it's thinking about how institutions, the educational system produces risk, the medical system produces risk, the economic system, the police system. And so what we do with these technologies is that we point them and we quantify the most vulnerable in our societies, and then we penalize them for not living up to these unrealistic metrics in which the whole thing is designed and rigged against them. Let's quantify risk. Let's look at risk-producing institutions and think about how it's very unlikely if you pop these apps into societies in which this inequality is so deep that somehow people are going to be these rational actors, which is an economic ideology, that the way that we make decisions is sitting there with our calculator and deciding, should I buy this, should I buy that, you know, as opposed to thinking about how people actually make decisions. And this is the danger of simply the reductive way of thinking that in our brains, that our brains work like these computer systems and simply make decisions based on that, right? So if you want to send your kids to school, but you don't have the money, if your mother gets sick and you need to send her to the hospital, if you got laid off from your job, you go to that little calculator in your head and you think, okay, what is the likelihood? Should I take this money out of this app? You don't make it based on simply how the balance sheet works out. You based it on the needs around you, the social needs around you. And so I think it's actually quite unfair to make it seem as if we all are just on this level playing field, you know, floating here with our little apps and our little calculators, as if we're not embedded in these social structures that makes it more likely that some of us will be laid off first, that some of our mothers will not be able to afford the hospital, that some of our school fees are out of reach. That is the playing field, and it's not even. And you enter in the technologies and the apps, and you say everyone just needs to make decisions based on responsible decision making. I'm going to take my mom to the hospital whether I have the money or not. And if I have to borrow the money and try to get another app to pay it, that's what I'm going to do. And I think that's what it means to have a socially conscious approach, is that we're not just these little rational actors that economic theory has made it out to be. Next question. Last question, maybe.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. I wanted to just ask even about, in terms of coming from the education perspective as well, because one thing that that is always in the back of my head is that even here is that most of the speakers and the production, they're in like international high-rated universities, which are actually white prehistorically as well. So how do African universities as well become respected, and also where our qualifications and our expertise are actually recognized within our own continent and in our own context?
Yeah. I mean, it's a great question, and I hope perhaps that can be a whole session where people put their minds together to think about how we're not just talking about a field, a scientific community, but we're talking about the education that actually leads up to this. And one of the things that again, if I had a dream team, if I was thinking about, you know, how we could begin to reshape this ship, is I wouldn't mimic the way that science and technology is taught in these countries where, you know, where you're exporting these speakers and getting. I would think about what is most meaningful in our local context, in our national context, and integrate the social and historical prowess and expertise into the technical fields. And I bet you 10 years from now, because what's happening now in my context is data science and computer science departments are scampering to figure out how to teach their students the ethics of technology. Why? Because of all of these headlines and news. And so they're scrambling because they hadn't thought about it before, right? And so they're going to pop in one little class here, pop in one little text or module here. What if we skipped all of that and we went to a much more holistic, integrated approach to thinking about computer science training? Again, this is idealistic because you still have to compete, you still have to publish in these same, dominant journals and so on, but let's begin to at least seed a different pedagogy and a different way of thinking about how we generate knowledge that is not simply about technological expertise, but about the social and historical imagination that's part and parcel. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ruha. Fascinating talk and questions as well. So we'll go right on to the break now. The next set of sessions is starting at 11.